Welcome to the Podkey summary of what's new in SwiftData from WWDC 2026. SwiftData is getting a few really practical upgrades, and they mostly come down to one theme: less glue code, more direct ways to observe and organize your data. The big pieces here are section queries for cleaner SwiftUI lists, codable attributes for awkward external types, and new observer APIs that let apps react to changes even outside the usual view layer. There are a couple of important catches too, especially around codable storage and observation lifetimes. So this is one of those updates where the convenience is real, but you do want to know where the edges are. One of the nicest quality of life changes is in Nowde. SwiftData 2027 adds a section by parameter, which means you can group fetch results by a key path, like a destination string, without building the sectioning logic yourself. If you've ever made a SwiftUI list and thought, "Why am I manually regrouping data I literally just fetched?" This is aimed right at that problem. The slightly quirky part is that the underlying query still gives you a flat array. So the group view comes through the wrapper's sections property using the underscore backing value, like the underscore trips, where you can iterate section IDs and the items inside each section. That means the fetch model stays familiar, but the UI code for section lists gets a lot cleaner. Another useful addition is the ability to mark model properties with Codable. That lets SwiftData store an encoded representation of types that aren't native models, like mkmap item identifier from MapKit. This is a pretty practical fix for real apps, because sometimes you just need to keep hold of an external framework type, and you don't want to invent a whole workaround structure for it. So in terms of convenience, this is great. You can keep that value on the model and let SwiftData persist it. But SwiftData treats those codable attributes as opaque blobs, and that matters. You can't use them in predicates, you can't sort by them, and you can't index them the way you might with more query-friendly model properties. So they're good for storage, not for rich querying. There's also a migration wrinkle. If the codable type changes shape later, adding or removing properties, for example, SwiftData won't automatically trigger a schema migration for that. And if the type itself isn't implemented in a forward-compatible way, older stored values can become unreadable. So the safe takeaway is to use Codable for external types you need to persist, not as a substitute for core app data that you'll want to query and evolve heavily over time. The other big theme in these updates is observation beyond the UI layer. ResultsObserver basically mirrors what tradeoff for fetching and monitoring changes, but it works anywhere in your app through SwiftObservation. That makes it especially handy for non-SwiftUI code, like game systems, controllers, or map logic. A good example here is recalculating map camera bounds whenever trips are added or removed. That's the kind of thing that absolutely depends on data changes, but doesn't naturally belong inside a view. So instead of treating your UI as the only place where data gets to be reactive, SwiftData now gives the same kind of pattern to the rest of the app, which feels overdue in a good way. There is one detail you really can't ignore. The observation only lives as long as its observation tracking token. The token comes back from with continuous observation. And if you want updates to keep flowing, you store that token on the observing object for as long as that object should stay active. If the token gets dropped, the observation stops. That's actually a pretty clean pattern once you know it, because it gives you a built-in way to turn observation on and off without leaking resources or leaving mystery listeners hanging around. It's one of those small API details that can save you an hour of confusion later. HistoryObserver is another interesting piece, because it watches SwiftData's persistent history and bumps an observable event counter whenever new transactions show up. That's useful when changes might come from outside the current process and your app still needs to react. So instead of only noticing the edits you made directly in front of you, the app can watch the broader history of the store and respond when something new lands. For syncing, this gets especially useful. Developers can filter by model type and by transaction author, like app, to avoid bouncing their own updates right back into the system. That keeps you out of the classic sync echo chamber, where app hears itself talk, and decides it's breaking news. From there, model context.fetch history can pull the delta, and the app can push those changes upstream to a server. Taken together, these updates make SwiftData feel a little more grown up. Section queries remove UI busywork, codable attributes cover a very real persistence gap, and the new observers make reactive data flow possible in places that aren't just SwiftUI views. The main caution signs are pretty straightforward. Don't expect codable attributes to behave like queryable fields, and don't lose track of your observation token unless you mean to stop observing. If you keep those limits in mind, there's a lot here that should make everyday app architecture simpler and less fussy. That's the roundup. A nice set of additions, a couple of sharp edges, and overall the kind of update that makes day-to-day code feel less ceremonial. And honestly, any release that cuts down on hand-rolled sectioning and mystery observation bugs is already being a pretty good citizen. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.